3 days after walking away from a wedding worth millions. He wasn't thinking about the bride. He wasn't thinking about the guests. Or the fallout. Or the quiet threats already beginning to form behind closed doors. He was thinking about her. The waitress. The way she stood there. Calm. Unshaken. While the entire room turned against her. Most people would have reacted. Defended themselves. Explained. Panicked. But she didn't. And that was the part he couldn't forget. Because in that moment, she hadn't just handled pressure. She had revealed something. Something real. Something rare. And now, standing in the middle of a city that suddenly felt unfamiliar, he sees her again. Not in a ballroom. Not surrounded by power. But somewhere he never expected. And this time, she's not serving anyone. If you're ready for a story about power, dignity, forbidden love, and the sweetest revenge you've ever witnessed, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this channel brings you the most addictive romance stories you won't find anywhere else. Drop a fire in the comments if you're team revenge. And let's get into this story. The headlines didn't take long. They never do. High-profile wedding cancelled mid-ceremony. Elite families in quiet dispute. Speculation rises around unexpected decision. But none of them got it right. They never do. Because from the outside, it looked impulsive, emotional, reckless. But inside, it had been the opposite. Calculated, unavoidable, necessary. Still, that didn't stop the consequences. The office was quieter than usual. Not peaceful. Not calm. Just careful. Conversations paused when he walked in. Eyes shifted. People adjusted themselves just slightly. As if trying not to be noticing him. He didn't react. Didn't acknowledge it. Just kept walking. Controlled. Composed. The same way he always was. But something had changed. Not on the surface. Not yet. But underneath. There was movement. You understand what you've done? The voice came from across the table. Low. Measured. Controlled. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry weight. He didn't answer immediately. Didn't rush to respond. Instead, he poured himself a drink. Slowly. Deliberately. As if the timing itself mattered. Then finally, I do. A pause. Not long. But enough. You've created a problem. Another pause. Then, no, he said quietly. I removed one. That was when the room shifted. Subtly. But noticeably. Because this wasn't just about a wedding. It never was. It was about alignment. Power. Expectation. And the silent agreements that hold entire systems together. And he had just broken one. Later that night, he stood alone. No noise. No distractions. Just the city stretching endlessly below him. Lights flickering in patterns that meant nothing. And everything. His reflection stared back at him through the glass. Sharp. Controlled. Unchanged. But his eyes were somewhere else. Back in that room. That moment. That silence. You didn't react. The words came back to him. Not spoken. Remembered. Because that's what stayed with him. Not the mistake. Not the glass. Not even the bride's voice cutting through the air. It was her. The way she didn't break. Didn't defend. Didn't shrink. She just stood there. And somehow, that had been louder than everything else. Sir? He turned slightly. One of his assistants. Careful posture. Measured tone. There are still people asking questions. I'm aware. And the other side. A pause. They're not letting this go. Of course they weren't. People like that never do. Not when reputation is involved. Not when control is questioned. Handle it. Yes, sir. The assistant hesitated. Just slightly. Then, there's something else. Now he looked at him fully. What? A few staff members from the venue, they mentioned someone. A beat. A waitress. Silence. Not long. But enough to matter. What about her? They said she left. Right after. Left how? No notice. No explanation. That was the first time something shifted visibly. Just a fraction. But it was there. Find her. The assistant blinked. Just once. As if confirming he heard correctly. Sir? Find her. No emphasis. No repetition. Just clarity. And that was enough. Because now, this wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a question. And he didn't like unanswered questions. But what he didn't realize yet was that this one wasn't going to be simple. At first, it seemed straightforward. A name. A shift record. A payroll entry. That's all it should have taken. That's all it ever takes. But this time, there was nothing. No full record? He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The man across from him shifted uncomfortably. We checked everything. Temporary staff logs, agency records. And? A pause. Nothing complete. That didn't make sense. Not in a system like this. Not in a place built on precision. Try again. We did. Then tried differently. By the second day, it stopped being routine and started becoming something else. Because every answer led to another gap. Every detail, incomplete. She was only there for a short time. No one knew her personally. She kept to herself. She didn't talk much. The same pattern. Over and over again. Not suspicious enough to alarm. But just enough to stand out. She wasn't supposed to be there long. That was the first line that mattered. He looked up. Explain. The manager hesitated. From what I understood, she filled in last minute. Someone didn't show up. And no one followed up? They tried. But she didn't come back. That didn't fit. Not with what he saw. People like her don't disappear without reason. By the third day, he stopped delegating. Stopped waiting. Started moving. Himself. The building wasn't impressive. Not like the venue. Not like the places he was used to. It was ordinary. Quiet. Almost forgettable. But something about it felt intentional. Can I help you? An older woman behind the desk. Calm. Observant. Yes. He placed a photo down. Taken from event footage. Not perfect. But clear enough. Have you seen her? The woman looked at it. Longer than expected. Not confused. Not searching. Just considering. Then, she doesn't like being found. That was new. He leaned slightly. Meaning? She comes here sometimes. Sometimes? A nod. But she doesn't stay. Why? The woman looked up at him now. Directly. Because she has somewhere else to be. Silence. Where? A pause. Then, that's not mine to tell. For the first time. Resistance. Not avoidance. Not confusion. Choice. And that changed everything. People usually don't ask twice, the woman added. I'm not most people. Another pause. Then, no. You're not. She studied him. Not impressed. Not intimidated. Just aware. Then finally. There's a clinic. A few streets from here. A beat. She volunteers there. That was it. The first real lead. But even then, something didn't sit right. Because now the question wasn't just, where is she? It became, why is she there? The street was quieter, less polished, more real. People moving with purpose, not presentation. The kind of place where things weren't hidden behind design. He stepped inside. And immediately, the atmosphere shifted. Not luxurious. Not controlled. But grounded. Human. And then, he saw her. Not in uniform. Not carrying anything. Not moving between tables. She was kneeling beside someone. Speaking softly. Listening. Focused in a way that made everything else disappear. And for the first time, he understood something he hadn't before. At the wedding, she wasn't just composed. She was choosing. She looked up. Their eyes met. No surprise. No reaction. Just recognition. And then, very calmly, she stood. You found me. Not a question. A statement. And just like that, the distance between them changed. Because now, this wasn't about a moment anymore. It was about the truth behind it. And he wasn't sure he was ready for that. For a moment, either of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because too much had already been understood. The noise of the clinic continued around them. Muted conversations. Soft footsteps. The quiet rhythm of people who didn't have time for unnecessary tension. And yet, between them, there was stillness. You found me. Her voice hadn't changed. Same calm. Same control. No curiosity. No surprise. As if this outcome had always been a possibility she had already accepted. I did. His response was simple. Measured. But there was something beneath it now. Something less certain than before. She studied him for a brief second. Not the way people usually did. Not with recognition of status. Or expectation. Just observation. Clear. Direct. Then she nodded slightly. Then you should say what you came to say. No invitation. No hostility. Just clarity. That caught him off guard. Not visibly, but internally. Because most people, in her position, would have asked questions. Why he was there. What he wanted. What it meant. But she didn't. You left. It wasn't an accusation. But it wasn't neutral either. I finished my shift. A small pause. Then I left. That's not what I meant. I know. Her tone didn't shift. But her eyes did. Just slightly. And yet, she continued, it's still the truth. That was the first moment he realized. This wasn't going to follow any structure he understood. You disappeared. No. A quiet correction. I moved on. The distinction landed heavier than expected. Because in his world, people don't just move on. Not without consequence. Not without reason. But she said it like it was simple. Like it required no explanation. You caused a situation. A faint pause. Then, no. She shook her head slightly. You did. That was the second shift. Subtle. But undeniable. He held her gaze, trying to read something. Anything. But there was nothing performative there. No attempt to provoke. No attempt to defend. Just truth. I stopped something that shouldn't have happened. Did you? Now there was something different. Not emotion, but precision. Or did you stop something you finally understood? That lingered. Longer than expected. Because it wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even a question. It was a mirror. He didn't respond immediately. Didn't deflect. Didn't redirect. And for the first time, he didn't control the pace of the conversation. Behind her, the person she had been helping shifted slightly. She turned, adjusted a blanket, spoke softly, tried to rest. Gentle, present, focused. Then she turned back to him. You shouldn't be here. Why not? Because this place doesn't need what you bring with you. That landed. Clean. Direct. And what do I bring? She held his gaze. Unmoving. Attention. A beat. Complication. Another beat. And expectation. None of it was said harshly. But none of it was soft either. Just accurate. You don't know anything about me. I know enough. Another silence. Because now, this wasn't about what happened at the wedding. It was about what that moment revealed. You didn't come here to thank me. No. You didn't come here to apologize. No. Then why are you here? That was the question. The real one. And for the first time, he didn't have an immediate answer. Because everything he thought it was felt incomplete now. I needed to understand. Her expression didn't change. But something behind it registered. Understand what? He held her gaze. Why you didn't react? There it was. The moment that had followed him. The silence that had stayed with him. Because in a room full of power, she had been the only one who didn't try to use it. And that didn't make sense to him. You think that's unusual? Yes. It's not. A small pause. It's just rare where you come from. That line shifted everything. Because now, this wasn't about her anymore. It was about him. And just like that, the balance between them changed again. You didn't stop that wedding because of me. Her voice was calm, certain, final. And this time, there was no space to misunderstand it. Because it wasn't a guess. It was the truth. And whether he accepted it or not, was about to define everything that came next. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled. Quietly. Deeply. You don't know that. His voice was steady. But not as certain as before. I do. No hesitation. No doubt. Because I've seen that look before. He frowned slightly. What look? The one where something breaks, but not in the way people expect. A pause. You didn't react to her. She continued. You reacted to what you realized in that moment. Her voice remained even. Measured. But every word landed exactly where it needed to. And what exactly do you think I realized? She didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know, but because she was choosing how much to say. That you were about to build something, on a foundation you didn't respect. Silence. Not loud. Not dramatic. But undeniable. And that bothered you more than anything, she said. He exhaled slowly. Not defensive. Not dismissive. Just processing. You make a lot of assumptions. I make observations. Another pause. Why were you there? He asked suddenly. At first, It seemed like a shift in direction. But it wasn't. Because now, he needed to understand her. Not the moment. Her. She held his gaze for a second. Then looked away. Not avoiding. Just considering. Because someone needed help. That's it. That's enough. It was such a simple answer. But it carried weight. Because in his world, nothing was ever just that. There are easier ways to help people. Easier for who? That stopped him. Because again, she wasn't arguing. She was reframing. You think I was there because I had to be. A small pause. I was there because I chose to be. That distinction. Hit differently. You don't understand that, do you? He didn't respond. Not because he couldn't. But because he wasn't sure she was wrong. I've worked in places like that before, she continued. Rooms where people measure worth based on what they can gain from you. Her tone didn't carry bitterness. Just clarity. And I learned something early. She looked at him again. You can tell everything about a person by how they treat someone who can't change their situation. That line wasn't new, but hearing it from her, in this context, it carried more weight than it had before. So you just accept it? No. A quiet correction. I recognize it. And then what? Then I decide what it means to me. Another pause. Not everything requires a reaction. That was it. The thing he couldn't understand before. The thing that stayed with him. She didn't stay silent because she was weak. She stayed silent because she didn't need to prove anything. And that was power. Real power. Not the kind he was used to, but something deeper. You've been through this before. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer directly. But her silence this time was different. Not controlled. Remembered. I've been in rooms where people thought I didn't matter. A small pause. And I've been in situations where reacting would have made things worse. Another pause. So I learned something. She looked at him. Dignity isn't loud. And just like that, everything he thought he understood about that moment shifted again. Because now, it wasn't just about what she did. It was about why. And that was something he had never truly considered before. You think I don't understand dignity? I think you're still learning what it looks like without control. That one landed the hardest. Because it wasn't an attack. It was a truth he hadn't faced yet. And the worst part? He wasn't sure he could deny it. You didn't come here for me, she said finally. A pause. You came here because something about that moment. She held his gaze. Didn't let you go. And that was the closest thing to the truth he had heard so far. The room felt quieter now. Not because the sounds had disappeared, but because something heavier had taken their place. You're right. The words came out before he could stop them. Not defensive. Not calculated. Just honest. And that alone shifted something. Because men like him don't say things like that easily. She didn't react immediately. Didn't acknowledge it with surprise. Just watched him. Carefully. As much as you think you understand what happened, she said slowly, you're still standing outside of it. A pause. You saw a moment. Her voice remained calm. But you haven't faced what it says about you. That landed deeper than anything before. Because up until now, he had been trying to define the situation. But she was forcing him to define himself. I made a decision. You reacted. A quiet correction. No. His tone sharpened slightly. I chose. And why did you choose it? That question didn't come with pressure, but it carried weight. Because there was no one else to answer it for him. He opened his mouth, then stopped. Because for the first time, the answer wasn't clear. Was it anger? No. Was it embarrassment? No. Was it her? His eyes lifted slightly. No. The word came slower now. More uncertain. It wasn't her. That realization wasn't loud. But it was real. And once it surfaced, it didn't go away. She nodded slightly. Not in approval. In recognition. You didn't stop that wedding because she was wrong. Silence. You stopped it. A small pause. Because you finally saw something in yourself you couldn't ignore. There it was. The truth. Clear. Unfiltered. Unavoidable. And this time, he didn't push back. Because he couldn't. Because somewhere, deep beneath everything he had built, he knew she was right. The image came back again. Not the argument. Not the voices. But the feeling. That split second where everything aligned. And something inside him said, this isn't right. Not for appearance. Not for power. Not for expectation. But for him. And that was the part he had been avoiding. I've spent my entire life making decisions that made sense. His voice was quieter now. Decisions that maintain structure, control, alignment. A pause. But that moment, he exhaled slowly, didn't follow any of that. No, she said softly. It didn't. Because it wasn't about logic. Another pause. It was about truth. That word hung differently. Because truth doesn't negotiate. It doesn't adjust. It just is. And now? She asked. Not pushing. Just allowing. He looked at her. Really looked this time. Not as the waitress. Not as the moment. But as the person who had forced him to see something he had avoided for years. I don't know what comes next. That was new. Not knowing. Not controlling. Just standing in uncertainty. And for someone like him, that was unfamiliar territory. She nodded. That's the first honest thing you've said since you got here. A faint shift in his expression. Not offense. Something else. Recognition. You expected something different, didn't you? She continued. He didn't answer. But she already knew. You thought you'd find meaning here. A pause. Closure. Another pause. Maybe even validation. Each word precise. And instead? Silence. You found yourself. That was it. The peak. Not dramatic. Not explosive. But undeniable. Because this wasn't about redemption. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't even about her anymore. It was about him. Standing face to face with something he could no longer ignore. And for the first time, he didn't try to escape it. He just stood there. Still. Present. And aware. And that was the real turning point. Not the wedding. Not the confrontation. But this. The moment he stopped looking outward. And finally looked inward. And didn't look away. There was no dramatic ending. No sudden shift. No clear resolution waiting at the edge of the moment. Just silence. The kind that doesn't demand to be filled. I should go, he said finally. Not as an escape. But as an understanding. She nodded. No attempt to stop him. No expectation that he would stay. Because whatever this was, It had already served its purpose. He turned, walked toward the door, each step steady, but different. Not because the world had changed, but because he had. And for the first time, he wasn't walking towards something expected. He was walking into something unknown. And somehow, that felt more real than anything he had left behind. Behind him. She didn't move. Didn't watch him go. Because she didn't need to. Some moments aren't meant to continue. They're meant to transform. And this one already had. Outside, the city moved the same way it always did. Unchanged. Unaware. But for him, everything felt different. Not clearer. Not easier. But honest. And that was enough. Sometimes, it's not the moment that changes your life. It's what that moment forces you to see. He didn't stop that wedding because of a mistake. He stopped it because, for the first time, something didn't feel right. And he chose not to ignore it. But the real question is, what happens after that? When the noise fades? When the pressure returns? When the world expects you to go back to who you were? Do you? Or do you keep walking forward? Even when you don't know where it leads? So tell me, did he make the right decision? Or did he realize the truth too late?